Good morning, everyone. We'll start in just a minute. Thanks for joining us this morning. So welcome to ICCR's next webinar in our series on just transition webinars. This is on performance-based regulation for a just energy transition, with a focus on building in equity and labor metrics to PBR. So next slide, please. Good morning and welcome. My name is Christina Herman. I'm the Senior Director for Climate Change and Environmental Justice at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. ICCR is a coalition of 300 global faith and values-based institutional investors that work together to engage the world's largest corporations on a whole range of social and environmental issues affecting communities in the US and globally. We feel strongly that justice must be at the heart of the societal changes needed to address the climate crisis, and are working to explore ways that we can collectively ensure a just transition as we shift to a clean energy economy. To make the massive shifts needed with the urgency required, we believe the transition must consider the concerns and needs of everyone affected, particularly the most vulnerable. As we talk with energy utilities about the need for a rapid but equitable transition to clean energy, we are very interested in the potential role that performance-based regulation can play. PBR is an approach to regulating electric utilities that aims to align a utility's profit motives with societal goals, such as decarbonization and resilience, and we hope climate justice. While the energy transition has seen important innovations in technology and the use of financial instruments, the regulation of the electricity sector, which sets the incentive structure for utilities, needs to be retooled to achieve a decarbonized, affordable, and equitable power supply at the pace we need it. PBR has gained significant traction in the United States in the past year and a half, with 4 new states, Connecticut, Illinois, North Carolina, and Washington, enacting laws authorizing PBR. Broadly speaking, PBR provides an alternative to the traditional cost of service regulation by compensating utilities for how they perform, rather than for selling more electricity or making new infrastructure investments solely. So last June, we held our first webinar about this topic, and we heard from many participants that it would be a good idea to look at the social considerations of this approach to regulation. We look forward to talking about the opportunities and the challenges associated with integrating equity into this new regulatory structure, and the great potential that better designed regulations can provide. I want to thank the presenters for their willingness to share their perspectives and expertise with us today. And you can see on the slide the speakers we have. In order of appearance, we have Kim Stokes, who's Executive Director on corporate and an corporate engagement strategist with Calvert Research and Management. Matthew McDonald, Partner and Executive Vice President, who's Head of Consulting Services at Stratagen, who's been working a lot on performance-based regulation with regulators. Mary Wambui, Asset Manager at the Planning Office for Urban Affairs for the Archdiocese of Boston, and May Lavore, Research Manager at Laborers International Union of North America, or LIUNA. So before I turn this over to our first speaker, I just want to offer a few housekeeping points. And Asabe, if you could go to that slide, I'd appreciate it. I think it's right before this one. Yeah. So this webinar will be recorded. We'll send a follow-up email to everyone with a link to the recording and contact emails for the speakers for follow-up questions later. We'll take time at the end of each presentation for clarifying questions and answers. So please enter those questions in the chat feature. And then we'll open it up for a broad Q&A at the end after everyone's presentations. So now I would, without further ado, I'd like to hand the webinar over to Kim Stokes from Calvert, who will get us started with an investor perspective on the energy transition and the importance of incorporating equity into that transition. So thanks very much, Kim.
Thank you, Christina. So one of the things that I often talk to Christina about is my long commute from my home to our offices where Calvert is located. And one of the things that I like to do during that commute is listen to podcasts. So, I would like to share with you one of the quotes that I heard from a recent podcast. So Dr. Dorcetta Taylor is a professor of environmental justice at the Yale School of Environment. And she said that in the United States and around the world, low income Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people tend to be living in spaces where environmental hazards, extreme natural and human made disasters, and environmental degradation occur more rampantly. And we all know on this podcast, both from scholarly research and anecdotal evidence from the communities themselves, that the disproportionate distribution of environmental hazards is to the poorest, brownest, and blackest people. And that it's no coincidence, as Taylor puts it, that it is by design. Racial inequities have been designed into the various economic and social systems that share our existence, from access to healthcare, access to affordable housing, access to food, and importantly for this webinar, the access to affordable, reliable, and cleaner energy. So why, as investors, should we care? It's because stakeholder voices, including customers and communities, matter, and they're becoming increasingly more important. It's because the regulatory construct and utility relationship to regulators, customers, and communities are directly tied to financial materiality and the debt and equity valuations of companies. Utilities in regulatory jurisdictions with performance-based rate making, decoupling for gas LDCs, and support for clean energy transition are just better investments and often have higher valuations. And it's a very complicated way that sometimes these incentives work to either support or detract from the transition. So, one example, quickly, I'd just like to point out is around natural gas distribution utilities. So, often the incentive for the utility is to spend more and more money on the existing infrastructure because this gives the company a very stable cash flows. So they're rewarded both from the regulatory construct and the rules around how they recover for investment in the gas infrastructure. And they're also rewarded on the equity and debt side. So, for example, for natural gas utilities, from a debt and credit rating perspective, gas utilities are seen as less risky than electric generation, so therefore have higher ratings. And so owning a gas utility in the past was one way that companies could help to stabilize ratings. And so that's why we saw a lot of companies going out and buying gas distribution systems. So we have to think about these incentives and how we can help to shift these incentives in order to support the energy transition. In my opinion, the Justice 40 initiative, federal infrastructure legislation, and efforts to incorporate equity and just transition in state policies have the potential to be game changing catalysts for utilities to address historical inequities and partner with communities to create the energy infrastructure of the future. But this requires us to act. So many times I go into a conversation with a utility company or attend a fundamental analyst conference, so not an ESG conference. And I hear from utilities, no one's asking us these questions. Of course, we know they are, but we just need to do it more and more and do it in spaces where maybe non ESG analysts and practitioners are also present. So I think, again, I'd like to just thank ICCR for really being an important partner to Calvert and getting into these conversations with utility companies, especially around just transition and equity, and being a great resource for us. So I just urge everyone on the call to really work together to make sure that we're really thinking about ways that utilities can kind of help shift the incentives and bring more power to communities and customers, and really focus on affordability, reliability, and cleaner energy for all. Thanks,
That's great.
Christina.
Thank you so much, Kim. That's great. A wonderful articulation of the concerns investors have. And I couldn't agree more with the importance of collective action. I mean, this is something that investors and community groups and labor and utilities can all work together on, and regulators. So thanks very much for that opening. I'm going to turn the webinar now over to Matt McDonald with Stratogen. And Matt, we're very grateful to have you back on our webinar to talk about performance-based regulation and equity. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you, Kim, for those excellent opening remarks, just to help us frame this conversation and why it's so important, both for utilities, regulators, stakeholders, and investors. My name is Matt McDonald. I'm Executive Vice President, head of the consulting team at Stratogen. I spent a lot of time within the regulatory space and within the regulated utility industry. Spent a half decade at the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, where, among many other things, I helped to spearhead an approach towards performance-based regulation that Hawaii's embraced, and have the privilege of working with many other regulators across the country on this issue. Just in my remarks today, building on some of the conversations we've continued to be having here in these forums, wanting to really emphasize the point that Kim made around the fact that incentives really do matter when it comes to the financial incentives that we are sending to regulated utilities through the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. We'll advance one more, please. So today, I really just wanted to set the stage for a much more interactive dialogue as we look at this concept of a performance-based regulation, perhaps through a broad lens, and really think about the fact that what we're experiencing right now through the energy transition really requires a reformed approach to how we regulate, and the regulatory framework needs to be evolved, reformed, and aligned with the outcomes that we truly want to be seeing from our energy systems, both on the electric and gas side. And as has been articulated, performance-based regulation is really a way to better align financial incentives that we're sending to our utilities with the outcomes that we want to see in the public interest, with customer interests. And it can be a useful tool in the toolkit, though it is not sufficient unto itself, in my humble opinion, to begin to address concerns specifically related to equity and labor and workforce issues as well. Next slide, please. So just to set the stage a bit, I think everyone on this call is very familiar with and appreciates the fact that we are in the midst of an ongoing energy transition. This transition is happening. It's exponential, and it's really impacting not just sort of traditional notions and supply side notions of how we perhaps move electrons across the system. It's really forcing some difficult conversations around the structure of the system itself, the distribution of how we generate electricity, and on the gas side, how do we deal with some of the public policy priorities that we have, and also critically, how we begin to address some of the inequities that have historically been structurally embedded into our energy systems. Next slide, please. Energy burden impacts in local communities have been present throughout, decade upon decade of the energy system as it's been experienced by customers and communities all across the country. And as Kim mentioned, this is too deeply embedded within the system, and something that we really need to take a hard look at. And our regulatory frameworks are simply not built to surface these issues and begin to address them holistically and within the regulatory framework itself. And there's real opportunities to do that, And performance-based regulation is a tool that can begin to surface these issues, illuminate them, and allow regulators and stakeholders and utilities alike to begin to address them more directly. And we'll get into a little bit more as to how we can envision that going forward here. Next slide, please. In addition to some of these equity concerns, as the energy transition progresses, we're also experiencing deep shifts in the workforce. So, labor and workforce that has been focused on certain categories of activity, those categories of activity are necessarily shifting over time as the energy transition progresses. So while overall labor and overall jobs may increase through the energy transition, certainly the nature and types of jobs are shifting, and a just transition requires very much attention to that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, and Kim spoke to this a little bit, but my mental model for the evolution of public policy objectives and criteria within the context of the energy transition, and specifically what regulators have been tasked to focus on, as well as utilities, there was these core pillars of prioritization around safety, reliability, and affordability, and those pillars have not gone away. It's incredibly important and still remains paramount that we focus on safety, reliability, and affordability. That said, what is in front of us from a policy perspective and in an imperative across climate and all the other equity and labor issues that we're facing is a real expansion in the policy objectives and criteria that need to be solved for across our energy systems. Criteria that include labor workforce development, resilience, equity, and decarbonization. Next slide, please. And what this really boils down to is the fact that there's sort of three key areas of focus in my mind when it comes to a just energy transition. For an energy transition to be just, it must be affordable, it must be equitable, and it must take into account the needs of a labor and workforce as the labor and workforce is required to shift and change its focus and categorization over time. And performance-based regulation is a way to embed in the regulatory framework an approach that aligns incentives and helps to illuminate data, metrics, and focus across all three of these categories. On the affordability and access front, there's an opportunity within a PBR framework to highlight performance and specific metrics across how affordable an energy system is and the energy burdens that are being placed on specific individuals and community groups. Within the energy equity space, there's again an opportunity for us to really illuminate and daylight how the system is being experienced by specific disadvantaged communities and whether reliability is experienced uniformly, or if certain areas of the geography that a utility is serving are experiencing far less service and reliability and far more disparate impacts from the production of that system. And then this enables us to then address that, through other mechanisms as well. On the labor side, there's opportunities, as we'll explore, to determine how much of the utility workforce is being served by a living wage. How much of this workforce is meeting other key metrics that we want to be assigning to measure the health of the labor force within a regulated service territory. Next slide, please. So when we get into the nuts and bolts of what it means to build out a performance-based regulatory framework, there's many different components. I'm highlighting two key categories of activities here, just in the interests of setting the stage for my colleagues Maeva and Mary to talk a little bit more about labor and equity issues specifically within the regulatory environment. But two categories of activities I'd like to call out. One is multi-year rate plans and the ability to establish revenue requirement caps that incent utilities to contain their costs and control costs over the life of a plan period. This is addressing the affordability piece and helping to align incentives around cost control, because if the just energy transition is not affordable, it will not be accepted by stakeholders, and it will become a roadblock and cause additional issues across all of these areas we care so much about. In addition, I'm highlighting on the bottom of this honeycomb graphic performance mechanisms. And really what I'm really wanting to highlight is metrics and the ability to identify performance through the simple measure of a unit of data. And this can, again, highlight areas of inequity. This can highlight areas of poor health, quote unquote, within our labor and workforce. And it can continue to progress in terms of sophistication such that we can be adding financial incentives and disincentives to these metrics. Now, and these are often known as performance incentive mechanisms when you're touching dollar signs. Now, not every metric that we want to measure across the system need have a financial dollar or penalty attached to it. In fact, some metrics are simply not appropriate to have dollars attached to them, but we still want to understand how our energy system is evolving and measuring up across some really key categories, specifically across equity, workforce, and labor areas. So next slide, please. I'll move ahead one more just to highlight a few examples of equity metrics and labor metrics, and then be able to pass the baton to my colleagues here today. So just a couple of examples of what are some examples of equity metrics within a PBR construct being visited today. So within a couple of examples that I wanted to highlight, in the state of Minnesota, for instance, and I alluded to this earlier in my remarks, the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission has been looking at system reliability in a much more granular way and bringing an equity lens to this metric. System reliability has been measured for decades on metrics, common metrics with acronyms such as SAIDI, SAIFI, CAIDI, and what that does is really provide us a system-wide view. But when we drill down into census block data or more specific granular geographic data, what we find is that certain disadvantaged communities may or may not be experiencing that same system reliability on a consistent basis. These are customers that are paying their proportionate share for that reliability, but are experiencing a far less reliable energy system due to where they sit within that energy infrastructure. And historically, regulators were just did not have visibility to the fact that this was happening and where it was happening and with what level of specificity. And so by this adage that you cannot control or address what you cannot measure, the ability to be able to surface this, illuminate it, and then in turn address it through the direction of additional investments and improvements in reliability is one example of how performance-based framework and the use of metrics can begin to help regulators and stakeholders address equity concerns across the system. In addition, in Illinois, they've been addressing the issue of energy burdens through some of the metrics to sort of measure that in a much more explicit manner and be able to track that over time as to how the energy system is affecting portability for folks. Next slide, please. And then finally, I know Meva will be speaking much more to this, but LIUNA has been working on identifying metrics that could be a part of a performance-based regulatory framework. And again, in the same spirit of being able to track how the energy system is measuring up when it comes to workforce compensation, workforce diversity, as well as workforce equity. And again, this becomes a sort of dashboard for regulators and stakeholders to be tracking and measuring how these important categories of activities are either being benchmarked against peers or are being tracked and historically measured over time so that we can be able to improve against these categories. Without having this visibility, it's very difficult for the regulatory community and utilities alike to understand how to improve performance across these domains. Next slide, please. And Kim mentioned this as well, but I just wanted to sort of, finally, leave some thoughts. I gave some examples from the electric sector. I think these same themes are perhaps even more acute in the gas distribution sector as well. And I think Kim articulated it, far better than I will in this moment. But natural gas utilities and the financial incentives that they're receiving from in the distribution sector, can be in tension with decarbonization goals and public policy goals that many states are importing. So again, performance-based regulation is an opportunity for the regulatory framework and financial incentives to evolve and shift to meet the needs of this current energy transition. So rather than a financial incentive that requires a gas distribution utility to continue to expand its system in order to be delivering returns to shareholders, we should be thinking about a reformation of these financial incentives such that we can control costs, we can prioritize perhaps repair of system instead of replacement, given concerns about asset life length and perhaps stranded assets across the system, and that are starting to measure specific performance metrics such as methane leakage, equity concerns, and some of the same labor concerns that have been highlighting across the gas sector. And thinking as well about specifically targeted incentives that help us think about a decarbonizing of this system in ways that will be shared across the sector. So with that, I wanted to conclude my remarks and looking forward to some interactive dialogue after we hear from both Mary and Maeva as well. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Matt. That was terrific. And I think your point about drilling down and really getting into the details, asking those, asking the right questions. If we ask different questions, we see different things. And I think that's seems to be at the heart of a lot of this change that we're talking about. So thank you. If you have questions of clarification, anything you didn't understand, please feel free to ask it now. And you can put your questions in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat as we go along. So I don't see any specific questions now. You were very clear, Matt, so thanks. So I think we'll shift now to Mary Wambui. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to have you back. Yeah, we're going to hear from Mary about really thoughts from the grassroots on equity. So over to you, Mary.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I hope I'm clear. I'd first like to say that I'm not an energy person at all, and that my energy equity work actually began because of my own experience in my own neighborhood of Lowell, Massachusetts. So it's not so much that, the planning office hired me for energy work. The planning office hired me for asset management work in the affordable housing sector. And my individual personal experience with the energy system and the experience of some of the most low-income households in Massachusetts made me very passionate about this topic. Full disclosure, I am a residential counselor at the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, meaning that I represent all Massachusetts residents in guiding the vision of energy efficiency at that Energy Efficiency Advisory Council. So I'll be looking at our experience, just our experience, what's going on. Next slide. So I will be looking at the performance-based regulation through the following three lenses: energy efficiency, grid modernization, and rate cases. So this is something that's happening in Massachusetts. We've been planning for our next 3-year energy efficiency and electrification plan, commonly known as Mass Save. And we are also reviewing electric sector modernization plans through a body called the GMAC, the Grid Modernization Advisory Council. And I'm a member there, not a member of the GMAC, but a member of the GMAC's Energy Equity Working Group. And the third lens is rate cases. Earlier this week, National Grid organized a stakeholder meeting to discuss their next rate case. Next slide. So for many years in Massachusetts, we could not easily convince utility companies that low and moderate income households, people who speak other languages apart from English, and a whole host of people were left behind in the implementation of a national leading program for energy efficiency. Massachusetts had been leading the nation in energy efficiency programs, implementation and delivery, but low income or environmental justice neighborhoods were not benefiting. And so in 2021, there was a 2021 or 2020, there was a study that showed that that was the case. So in our planning for the 2022 to 2024 plan, we inserted, I can say inserted or proposed a PI mechanism that would incentivize equity in our plan. That was not easy. As you can see, our equity benefits were much higher than what was actually approved by the Department of Public Utilities then. But we took it anyway. And what you have before you on the slide is what is currently happening. I'd been in the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council from 2017, and it's in 2022 that I saw the first presentation that says exactly what that thing says there: program highlights, equity in focus. And this was a presentation by investor-owned utilities or our program administrators. This never existed, but with the PI, it began to exist. And as you can see, there's a program called Community First Partnership. It became fully launched because it's part of those equity benefits that are in the performance incentive mechanism. And a lot has gone on. Next slide. As you can see, there's a picture. This is still the impact of having a performance incentive mechanism in our energy efficiency goals. Many years ago, the section on workforce development in the hundreds of pages of the Massachusetts State Energy Efficiency Plan used to be few lines, like 3 or 4 lines. It's just like something is passing by. It's not that anymore. This is a massive supplier diversity summit organized by massive program administrators, bringing in Black and Brown communities to participate in the $4 billion state's energy efficiency, engine. So we all live here. There are jobs, there are contracts, but I'd not seen a lot of Black or Brown people delivering energy efficiency. But now, because of the PIMS, because of those targets on clean energy contracts, jobs, and workforce development, this is what we have. Something else, the slide is not very clear, but it's about what we call the clean energy pathways. It's run by the Massachusetts program administrators, and it's education and placement for mainly Black and Brown households to get skills in the energy efficiency and electrification sector. You would not have seen this without a PIM. And I say that with all due respect to many others who are in this room who work for our energy companies. The next slide. Now, on September 1st, the investor-owned utilities submitted the electric sector modernization plans for the purpose of, taking care of the demand for electricity as we switch fuels. When myself and many other people went through the initial ESMPs, equity was there as a word, but there wasn't much substance. The ESMPs lacked information on foundational infrastructure investments that will be targeted to EJCs. There were also important details for decision-making that were missing in these plans. The language, on the other hand, was not easy for people like myself to understand or be able to meaningfully engage and participate. There's another fact that benefit cost analysis does not usually get at distribution of benefits. We in Massachusetts know that even though we had money for energy efficiency, the energy efficiency benefits were not distributed in a just manner across the Commonwealth, something we are rectifying on the energy efficiency side. But when we come to the grid modernization, this is a conversation that needs to take place. And I should say that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts formed a grid modernization advisory council for equity, so that when these plans are reviewed, there will be equity component inside of them. What is at stake for communities when we are talking about modernizing the grid? One, we have energy burdens. They are very high. And when you have grid modernization planning that does not provide you with decision-making analysis, it's grossly negligent. So there must be like an intentional process that interrogates what a customer electricity bill consists of. And then there's something else that's at stake for community. This is an ongoing process, so it's going on right now. The intervening or meaningful participation. Usually, we don't have all voices in the process of the approval process of this part of the energy ecosystem. Transparency of data continues to be a big deal in energy efficiency. Maybe Matt and his team will come up with a really smart way that we can actually have a data access and transparency performance incentive mechanism. And then access to technology, shared ownership, resilience, economic growth, and monitoring, evaluation, and continuous improvement. Basically, what I'm trying to say is this: it will not be a just transition if we will modernize the grid using the same old methods that we have used in the past. And therefore, people like myself would actually like these electric sector modernization plans to be viewed through an environmental justice lens. Next slide. Sorry, I forgot to say on that previous slide that there's an EWG, an equity working group on the grid modernization side, and we have put forth proposals of what equity metrics should look like while modernizing the grid. The process is ongoing, but those metrics actually exist. Next slide. This one may not be very clear, but this is about the National Grid's rate case. So they're going to file a rate case, I think, on the 16th of November. And they have provided us with what, the performance incentives that they think are appropriate. And the reality is, when they, a few weeks ago, when they reached out to have this stakeholder engagement, the outreach was not very, it was not very well done. And I mean, how do you actually have a stakeholder process, provide detail to stakeholders that you expect to respond in less than a month, and you're saying that you're going to be filing this awesome thing that's going to affect their lives? So that that was not there. Next slide, please. So what are my thoughts and the thoughts of others on how this rate case is going? One, on the affordability PIM, they want to be incentivized for their outreach to discount rate customers. And I'm like, why do you want to get incentivized for something you should just be doing anyway? I mean, let's just be real. So that to me is not a PIM. So for this, for affordability to happen, we need to eliminate the conditions within the energy system that cause many not to participate. And helping those who are unable to pay their bills should be a priority. It should not be monetized. Even if the monetization is like a drop in the ocean, it should be, I think, considering all the years that we've had an energy ecosystem that is not just and has structural injustices embedded in it. In 2023, when folks said that they want to incentivize affordability outreach, to me, it's really ridiculous. Secondly, the PIMs that I just shared were on affordability, capital delivery, clean energy adoption, greenhouse gas GHG emission reduction, and customer engagement. It's 2023. There should be one there that says equity, if we are very sincere about what we want to do. As I said earlier, the initial stakeholder engagement was not designed to maximize representation or elevate meaningful participation of EJCs. Recognition, distributive, and procedural dimensions of justice should be part of PBRs. Another thing is that we need to approach PBRs with honesty. We've not been given equity in the cost of service regulation models. We can't close our eyes and assume it's just going to work. On the other hand, we are missing in this rate case, like it's silent on how historical and systemic disparities in energy securities and affordabilities would be addressed. This was an article last year on utilities shutoffs rising in Massachusetts. I mean, how do you have utility shutoffs rising and you don't have something like that in your proposed PIM? So anyway, I think that's the end for me.
Mary, thank you so much. That was actually incredibly helpful. And I loved your point about, we've talked to companies a lot about the importance of stakeholder engagement, and your point about, if companies are going to take stakeholder engagement seriously, they need to think very seriously and carefully about who needs to be at the table, how to communicate, and then to give stakeholders adequate time. And I would also add resources to be able to understand what the company's proposing, because to have meaningful participation, it can't be in utility speak that people, most people can't understand. And so whether that is resources to help hire someone for the community to represent them, to help them really understand and have a participatory process. I don't know. It would be interesting to get into that sort of conversation later. Or it's simply making, putting the plans into plain English. Important, very important part of all of this. But thank you so much for all the points you made about the importance of equity and what that looks like at a more granular level. Are there any questions for Mary? Primarily questions of clarification. We can get into a discussion later. Okay, well, hearing none. Thanks again, Mary. I'm going to turn now to Meva Lohr who is with LiUNA. And Meva has done a lot of really great research. We've been working with LiUNA on labor metrics, this key question of how to identify appropriate metrics. So Meva, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Good morning. My name is Meva Lohr. I manage research for the Department of Corporate Affairs at LiUNA. And for about the last 5 or 6 years, I've been helping our local affiliates on these regulatory kind of utility matters. So you can, next slide, please. So really quickly, I'm just going to give you an overview of why we started to do this work in the first place, what we've learned from the process, and hopefully, call to action that you all can do today kind of to support workers in this space. Next slide. So you all know who we are, but as a reminder, 500,000 members, about 80 pension funds, about 60 billion of assets under management. Utilities, we're not only invested in them, they're also our employers, and they're a significant employer for our union. And, many of you know, but I don't, not everyone knows, but many people know that their utilities use this sort of hybrid employment model where they have their own in-house bargaining unit, they have their in-house staff, and then they contract out, capital projects and increasingly O&M to construction contractors. Obviously this gives utilities some labor flexibility, but what it means is that even though, folks like our members are working side by side with the in-house workforce, we're oftentimes excluded from those transition conversations. And also because of that sort of employment model, oftentimes regulators have no line of sight into labor conditions for this workforce, or even basic things like pay and benefits. They have no line of sight. Next slide. So this just kind of illustrates why this is important, why this sector is important for us. So the slide, the chart on the left, so every year the Department of Energy does an employment in energy report. And you'll see what this first chart hopefully illustrates is that there are actually more construction workers building power plants, more construction workers building the distribution and transmission infrastructure than there are actual employees of utilities who are doing that. In fact, this construction workers, right, the construction industry, that's the largest sort of employer. So, there, and as you can see over the last 10 years, CapEx that utilities have been spending has significantly increased, almost doubling within the last 10 years. And those capital projects are being built by contractors. And so with the rise of, capital investments, you also have the rise of this workforce. Next slide, please. Okay, so our engagement, kind of similar to what Mary was saying, was really organic in the sense that we had local leaders who really saw kind of eroding labor standards in this space. And so we had situations where, like in DC, for example, a worker doing basically the same thing on a project, on an underground infrastructure project, whether that be a water line, a sewer line, broadband, a natural gas distribution line, or an undergrounding of an electric or transmission line. The scope of work for our members is basically the same. And yet, depending on who the owner is, right, is whether it's an investor-owned utility or a public entity, the pay and benefits was significantly inequitable. And so it was really, and then when we would engage the utilities around this to try to remedy this, their response was, this is out of our hands. We have to keep rates low. Our rates all of our costs are highly scrutinized. And so the road led back, I guess, to regulators, right? Regulators are the ones, because these are highly regulated investor-owned utilities, right? They set ROE, they have to approve infrastructure riders, right? They have to approve labor costs. And increasingly, our engagement has been around ensuring that, these commissioners are also the folks who are implementing, right, these state climate and energy goals. And so we're increasingly engaging around that as well. Next slide. Okay, these are some of the types of proceedings that we've engaged in. And I guess I'm going to use the term PBR kind of very liberally to include anything other than kind of traditional cost of service rate making. So we have engaged in technically what are PBRs with PIMs or multi-year rate plans. But our engagement really started with merger transactions. So next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to go over these case studies. Next slide, please. Okay, so this was like 2017, 2018. As you all will recall, there was a flurry, right? There was a lot of merger and there was a lot of M&A activity in the 2010s, right? With utilities, these local utilities being bought by much larger holding companies. And so in Avista, Hydro One is a Canadian company, had proposed to buy Avista. It was a $5.3 billion transaction, needed approval in 5 states. So the first thing we had to do was like think about, okay, what's the labor hook here? And just to put it simply, and maybe Matt could expand on this, but it seemed to me that like the hook was, approval was based upon whether or not that transaction provided a net benefit and whether or not it was within the public interest and did not result in any harm. It's oversimplification. And so depending on kind of where we were at in different states with different utilities, our request or what we're trying to propose is different. So in this case, we were already getting the natural gas distribution work for Avista. We were getting a lot of the hydroelectric power work. We weren't getting other electric work, and we weren't getting work that we used to have, which is traffic control work. And so increasingly, the model has been that because this is seen as a low-skilled kind of job, they've contracted out basically to the lowest bidder. And so now you have specifically temporary staffing agencies who only do traffic control. So these used to be, good union jobs, and now they're, minimum wage jobs. Folks who work these jobs would qualify for LIHEAP. And so so even before we were accepted as a party, the Attorney General in Washington State objected to our intervention. So that just to illustrate how hard it is sometimes to even get in the door. And so we had to file an appeal, and the commission granted our appeal with limitations. So they really limited kind of the scope of issues that we could raise in the proceeding. But ultimately, we did come to a settlement with Avista Hydro One that basically protected our work for 10 years. It brought flagging back in-house to union work. It required contractors to utilize our training, and it encouraged contractors to use union labor on future capital projects. I would say that the support we got from the environmental organizations really helped us get over the top. Unfortunately, or fortunately, this transaction was never consummated due to, political issues in Ontario. But it's an example of, how we've been able to use these cases to grow our work. Next slide, please. Same thing in Pennsylvania, right? This was Aqua America, now Essential Utilities, buying People's Natural Gas. I think this was like in 2018. The Pennsylvania standard, right, is, promote public service, provide some sort of substantial benefit, or and we were not substantial benefit, but no net, provide net benefits. So what we try to do there is we were already getting this work in Pittsburgh. So we wanted to just hold harmless, right, our workforce. So they would be automatically continue to do this work after the merger. And then we expanded kind of our scope of work again to flaggers. So now they're union flaggers, and we also expanded our work to the Pittsburgh suburbs as well. Next slide. And then I wanted to share this example. This is the AltaGas Washington Gas merger. AltaGas paid $6.4 billion for Washington Gas. It was a transaction that needed to be approved in 3 states. And I would say with this one, kind of one of the key takeaways was, so each, obviously Washington, Virginia, and Maryland, Maryland, DC, Virginia, have the politics of these commissions matter. And so what we try to do was really kind of elevate, win these standards in the most progressive jurisdiction, and then have it apply to the other jurisdictions. And so here we didn't get anything in Virginia, but we were able to maintain our market share in Maryland and DC, and we raised flagger wages by about $8 to $25. I would say that the downside of this kind of arrangement was it was a 3-year agreement that we had with AltaGas, and the 3 years has expired, and now flaggers' wages are minimum wages jobs again. Next slide. We haven't had a lot of success in rate cases, but I wanted to show one example of success. And this was a similar situation, Pittsburgh area. These used to be flagging, used to be good union jobs. PECO came in for a rate case in Pennsylvania. And what we really entered into the record was the poverty level wages that these workers were getting paid. And so we got some affidavits from workers that we submitted into the record. And then the other thing we did is we investigated kind of the safety record of this traffic control company, Flagger Force. They're really the kind of non-union, low-wage contractor in the Mid-Atlantic area for traffic control. And we found that they were actually charging, their charge rate was almost $50 an hour. And these workers were getting paid $11, $13 an hour, right? And so in our mind, there wasn't like a cost differential then, right? If you keep using Flagger Force, they just had a more significant markup. And ultimately, next slide, please. We were able to bring that work back in-house. So now traffic control is done by our union contractors, it's done by our union members. That was a settlement that we reached outside of the main settlement on the rate case. Next slide. So we, performance-based rate making, our PEPCO experience, this was a 2-year endeavor. Lots of work, and spoiler alert, we didn't get the outcome we wanted, but we learned a lot in the process. And I think it also illustrates kind of the structural challenges that labor or any kind of other stakeholders have in these types of proceedings. And so DC for a very long time had only done kind of traditional rate making. DC and Maryland around the same time started to entertain kind of PBR, and they invited the utilities to put in PBR or multi-year rate plan kind of cases. And so this was the first PBR in DC. And, it was a PEPCO case, 3-year, about $170 million, plus a bunch of PIMs, 9.7% ROE. And we had, our local here has significant experience kind of trying to organize sort of that workforce, or, we talk a lot to this workforce. And so a couple of years ago, we had done a survey of hundreds of workers and found that 22% of them weren't even earning the minimum wage in DC. And we learned that about 40% of them did not get health insurance from their employer. And so, we had, half a dozen workers testify at the public hearing. We submitted all of our survey records, into the public record, only redacting, personal identifying information. And yet, next slide, please. And so our proposal was twofold. This is our best, our first effort at kind of PBR PIMS. And that was, to ask the commission to not, to reduce PEPCO's rate of equity in the event that it does use contractors who break the law, right? That, we should incent PEPCO to incent its contractors to comply with the law. And so it was if PEPCO is not enforcing, the law with their contractors, they should get an automatic reduction to their ROE. And then the other thing we asked for, so DC is really into working groups and task force. And so I thought that this would kind of reflect that, maybe would be a more palatable approach, was just to set up an advisory group, set up a workforce, with a workforce advisory group with various stakeholders to talk about what can we start collecting information on so that we could basically offer a vision for what a PIM would look like and what quality labor standards actually look like. Next slide, please. And, the commission ultimately rejected our proposal, but they rejected everyone else's proposals. All the other, OPC had a couple of affordability PIMs, those were rejected. DC government had a couple greenhouse gas reductions and other PIMs, and those were, rejected. And obviously our PIM were rejected, but the commission actually went a little bit further than we thought they would, which was they actually said in the order that they don't believe they should impose penalties onto PEPCO for whatever violations of its contractors. And so that, that was a little bit alarming and a little bit disappointing, but, this was really, I don't know, that's all I'll say about it. That's all I'll say about that, that case. Next slide. This is a live case that we're in right now, and it's a multi-year BG&E's Baltimore Gas and Electric second multi-year rate case in Maryland. And the background to this is, we had tried to engage, we had intervened in rate cases, BG&E rate cases in Maryland before. And, I would say that the commission there basically just totally ignored us. Like they don't even regard, they don't even cite, they just ignored us. There were data requests on just basic, labor employment information that the commission ruled was out of scope in those past proceedings. And so before we engaged again, we felt like we needed, or, we did need some sort of mandate, from the legislature for the commission to engage. And so there were a couple laws that were passed in 2021. The first one mandates local prevailing wages anytime, an investor-owned utility or their contractor cuts into the street. So any underground excavation is automatically prevailing wage. And so that passed in 2021. And, the governor vetoed it and the legislature overrode it. And yet, the law went into effect in 2022, and yet there was rampant noncompliance, even, among our own union contractors. There was this rampant noncompliance. The other law that passed in 2021 was a law that expanded expanded the statutory factors that the commission must consider in their oversight of these utilities. And it expanded those factors to include, climate impacts and also fair and stable labor standards for the applicable workforce. So the legislature kind of gave, the commission that mandate. So we haven't tested kind of this new mandate. And so this this is a case in which we'll see. We'll see what how this commission interprets that. The commission, after after that law was passed, they did send kind of a notice saying, we have these new statutory factors. We invite parties to explore, within these proceedings, how we should consider these impacts. So there's a new commission now in Maryland. It's a Democratic controlled commission. I don't know, we'll see whether or not we get a different outcome. Next slide. And then just really briefly, some of our initiatives at FERC. Obviously we're engaged in like these certificate cases around natural gas pipelines. We have been able to, there specifically, I guess I'll talk about ET Rover. So the way that we've been able to, I guess, even tie or raise our hook for labor standards on these cases has been that all the operators have to file a resource report 5 in their application. It's their socioeconomics. And oftentimes in that socioeconomics report, the operator will tell you what the overall economic output would be of that project, right? Sometimes overstating the economic benefits while they're in the application process. And so this is an energy transfer partner project, hundreds of miles of natural gas pipeline crisscrossing the Midwest. And the operators said in their FERC filing that 60% of the workforce would be hired locally. And we knew, because we knew who the operator had hired, we knew which contractors the operators had hired, we knew that they could not reach that 60% metric using this one non-union contractor. And so in this case, we weren't a party, but we did know this landowner group who was a party to this case. And they asked us, we asked them to ask, the commission asked the operator to substantiate the 60% claim. And that helped, us win that work. So that project went 100% union. When the commission, the commissioners have actually weighed in on our issues, they've had a pretty hands-on approach. But what they did say in one order, this is a natural gas pipeline feeding an Elgin plant along the Gulf Coast. They said this was like they had 15% local employment in their application. That was their estimates. There's significant EJ impacts on this project. And so, the commission said we don't have any authority to require the use of union labor, but we encourage you to create good jobs, especially for local workers. And then we have a proposed policy statement that I'll talk about at the end. Next slide. Okay, so next slide. I mean, many of you are familiar, right, with some of the labor issues related to clean energy. I'll talk about 2. Wages are significantly lower in clean energy, and that makes sense, right? So these are national averages, just to show you kind of how much less money, workers in solar and wind make compared to what they would make at a fossil fuel plant. And this makes sense, right? Because workers have won these wage and benefit gains over years, right? And now they're coming in, now we have a whole new kind of set of players. And so, in the beginning, we were just seeing a lot of, out-of-state workers who were employed in Wisconsin. One of the first major utility scale projects had like 22% workers who were local. There was a significant project in Colorado. Workers there were getting paid $14 an hour. And recent observations of the solar projects in Virginia, shows the same kind of dynamic, $13 to $15 wages, 1099, so they're viewed as, they're categorized as independent contractors, and majority have been out of state. Next slide. And here's kind of a real live example of why we need to engage the commission. So Arizona ranks 4th nationally for solar under development. There's a huge 1 gigawatt project right now by Copia Power. Copia Power is backed by Carlyle Group. in Maricopa County, 6,500 acres of solar panels. It's a significant job. Their contractor is Solve, who is using a temporary staffing agency for what would be our scope of work. And, you know, the differential between, I guess, the non-union and union package is a couple $2 million. And all of that few $1 million is saved by not paying travel pay, you know, per diem for these temporary workers, right? And so that just shows you kind of like how how that kind of erosion like has a significant impact, right, on the workforce. You know, when we have engaged with Copiah Power around this, they say, you know, they're not allowed to increase their costs. They're not allowed to increase these labor costs, right? Because one of their, you know, they have various buyers for all stages of their project. But they have 300 megawatts that's being sold under a power purchase agreement to Arizona Public Service. And so Arizona Public Service is owned by Pinnacle West Corporation, which is, you know, traded on the New York Stock Exchange. And so the road leads back, right, to the regulators, because there was, you know, these are competitively negotiated projects. And so, you know, we've had to get, what we've learned is we need to be at the table in the very beginning, right, before this PPA is awarded. Next slide. Next slide. So transitioning a little bit to gas metrics, because that's, you know, PBR and just transition. We've been working with, there have been a couple of proceedings in Colorado. So first, the legislature passed a reduction. You know, natural gas utilities need to reduce their carbon emissions. I believe it's by 40% in 2025. Significant. I'm sorry, but you know, they have to reduce their gas emissions, and so there have been a couple proceedings that the commission has initiated in order to write these rules. And so we've been involved in some of the gas infrastructure planning and clean heat planning rulemaking proceedings. And so what we got out of that proceeding, working with, you know, environmental organizations and also by direct engagement with Xcel, is a reporting in the gas transition, you know, for new gas infrastructure projects, or in the events, you know, when in determining the best clean heat, you know, plan portfolio, that labor metrics will be considered. And so we got it in the rules, a definition of best value employment metrics to include the length and types of training available, plus apprenticeship programs, what percentage is estimated to be Colorado state workers versus out-of-state workers, what are the types of careers that will be supported by this project? Will this project be covered by collective bargaining agreement? And what are the wages and benefit contributions that are actually paid to this workforce? And so depending on, you know, whatever the type of proceeding, there will be some sort of reporting of these metrics. So on the right is, you know, Xcel Public Service of Colorado recently issued their first gas infrastructure planning process. And this is an example of how they have, I guess, interpreted these metrics, right? Which was showing for a pipeline project and its alternative, what the exact, you know, workers, who the workers are, how much they get paid, and what their duration is. You know, we did raise some issues with some of the wage and benefit information they're using. But this gives you kind of just a picture of, you know, their first attempt at implementing these metrics. The Colorado Clean Heat Plan proceeding, you know, Public Service submitted their application a couple months ago. We're in that proceeding. And so again, they, you know, during that process, they actually will hold a separate hearing to talk about labor issues specifically, but we have, you know, this same sort of reporting in there. And, you know, the goal of that was really to in this case, you know, I think the legislature is a little bit further ahead than the commission. And so, you know, part of the intent of our participation was ensuring that the rules actually meet legislative intent. And so we're not creating new standards. We're just saying, this is how you implement that intent. Next slide. And this is an example of this. So this is public service companies, their preferred portfolio for their, you know, for their IRP. And, you know, they had to score each kind of set of proposals. And this is in the electric, space, but they had to score each of those, you know, portfolios to see, you know, which portfolios had, you know, the highest score in terms of determining what is a good job. And, you know, as you can see here, the one in the red is what Xcel wants to do, even though, you know, the one in the middle, the 79%, that would be using project labor agreements to build out these resources. So, you know, I share this to say, you know, these, you know, rules and regulations, and it has yet to be determined how, if you know, these processes will actually result in actual good jobs in the clean energy sector, or a fair transition for, you know, for folks like our members. Next slide.
Yeah, Maeva, I think we're going to have to wrap
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry. I'm
We've got
sorry.
very little time
sorry
for
for going over.
questions left. We're going to end at 11:15, but thanks. Are there any sort of final comments you want to make? I mean, this is fascinating, and it gives us a picture into the amount of work that goes into these rate cases and proceedings. It's just a huge amount of detail and struggle. I mean, so yeah, maybe I'll just let you just finish up if you have any sort of final remarks, but I'd love to open it up to like a conversation about how we can all work together on this.
I think that's what we should reserve the the rest of the time.
Okay, fine, great. So yeah, thanks again. I found it particularly, I mean, I'm in Washington, D.C., so I was really eating up all the information about Pepco and Washington Gas. There's so I want to allow questions from anyone who may be, in our audience who has questions. Or if any of the speakers have questions for one another, I think that might be really productive. Matt and Mary, I'm sort of wondering if you have questions for Maeva, or if, or if you have questions, Maeva, for Mary or Matt, or Mary, if you have any questions, just wondering.
I mean, I have one question for Matt, and that is, to what extent does PBR, or even, the inclusion of these sort of equity metrics depend on the politics of a state commission?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, politics have always had an impact on utility commissions. It's just, whether that's direct or indirect, I think, certainly depends on the commission itself, the commissioners, and the sort of broader external dynamics. Anytime we're talking about these state level government institutions, it's sort of the height of naivete to make some sort of statement that there aren't political dynamics at stake here. So that does matter. Very clearly. I think, stepping into a conversation, candidly, around equity metrics in a state like, say, Washington State or Illinois, versus some other states that may not have the same level of appreciation or other state legislative objectives and goals that might inform the depth and richness of those equity metrics, I think does matter. And I think, how I would respond to that is, I think as we've seen with other areas of just transition or even just energy transition, there are phases and stages that we go through in each of these living laboratories of states, right? And so I think it starts with those going first, perhaps stubbing a toe here or there, maybe not getting all the way across the finish line on some key issues, but learning from that, refining and sort of building those case studies such that this is not a novel topic any longer, and we start to move towards that next phase of adoption across the states. I think national organizations like NARUC and NASIO and NCSL can be really important educational forums for commissioners, regulators, state energy officials to understand what their role can and should be in some of these topics. And that does include this relationship between legislature and commissions in some jurisdictions. Commissioners sometimes are restricted or constrained a bit by legal authority and how they have to apply that in certain circumstances. So let's identify where those gaps are, and let's investigate whether we should be closing them through legislation that helps to embed these topics within the frameworks in manners that they should be. Just some reflections to that prompt. Maybe.
That's great, Matt. Thanks. I'm wondering if you have advice for investors. What do you see as the role of investors in all of this?
I'm happy to chime in, but Mary, you're coming off mute, so please take it first.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very engaged in conversations with IOUs, and I think we are past the stage of asking whether this is important or whether it matters and what it means for investors. I think what investors can do is actually deal with their appetite for high returns, because some of these equity metrics are expensive to put in the system right now, but they matter. And sometimes the benefit is not going to be financial for investors. But I think recognizing that this matters and it's important and that it needs to be done, or even reaching out and speaking to people on the ground, which is something we're now seeing in Massachusetts. For the first time, I've actually had investors from National Grid or Eversource call to ask, what do you think we should do? How can we help? So I think just being open-minded about it is very important.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for that, because I think there's it's like we talk a lot about externalities and certain, company operations, and other people are paying the costs that those externalities, in the same way that investors are perhaps have been making money and that money has not flowed in the directions in which it should have and could beneficially for those communities and for all of society. So I think as we think about systemic risk, maybe we should start thinking about systemic benefits as well, how we build a healthier, more equitable economy that's actually going to benefit everyone, and then benefits be broadly shared, but investors would be part of that. So I think that's our vision, at least for the churches and values-based investors. So I think your words will land well with our network. Curious, Matt, what you were going to say in terms of, just advice, or, what do you think a potential role for investors in this, perhaps in the regulatory space, is?
Yeah, just quickly, because I think you know, we're running a little bit short on time. I think, you know, Kim at the top really laid out some really, you know, important themes for investors, and I'd want to just point back to those. For me, if you know, if I'm putting myself in the seat of investor, I think I would be looking very hard at the regulated utility landscape and wanting to know better as to whether that systemic risk component, and I love this concept of systemic benefits as well, but looking at the risk component, is that am I able to appropriately price that in to how I'm thinking about evaluating my investments? Because I don't have the requisite visibility into this institution, this organization's performance. And really, as we continue to progress down this pathway, you know, we may be getting to places where we need to start thinking about the social license of these entities, because they are public service corporations, because they are such heavily regulated entities. As an investor, I want to know that my investment is going to be performing in a way that's maintaining its social license fundamentally as a foundational component and requisite component. Beyond that, I think, you know, performance-based regulation and metrics that allow us to measure performance can also be a very astute and an important tie-in to the types of metrics that we want to be seeing from an ESG lens and an investor lens as well. So there can be a handshake here in terms of how we think about evolving a performance-based regulatory approach and the incentives we're allowing utilities to earn from, as well as how that maps to ESG and how we're maintaining a social license for these institutions going forward. We just saw in Maine, there was, you know, an important ballot measure, you know, whether or not those electric utilities should be taken public. Now that ballot measure failed, but I point to that as a really, you know, sort of astute example of, you know, social license matters, and the way in which we regulate and the way in which investors should be evaluating their investments, I think, in that lens should really matter as well. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Great point. We're a bit over time. Mary, you might get the last word.
Yeah, it's just an example. During this year, there was a consumers award for the Community Fast Partnership. National Grid and Eversource were very happy that they won that award. And I sent them a message reminding them how we fought for them to begin that program. So investors win, a lot of publicity, doing good work. It's something adding to their portfolio. So yeah, just wanted to share that example.
Well, thanks very much. And one more, Maeva, I want to let you respond if you have any thoughts on this before we wrap up.
Yeah, so I thought about this, about how, you know, we can support each other's work. And I mean, I think one, some investor engagement when these utilities put out their integrated resource plans or in advance of their request for proposals. And so, you know, you'll, you know, in the very beginning of the process, you know, you can start expressing kind of the need for, you know, high quality labor standards. And obviously with Inflation Reduction Act and now, you know, these enhanced tax credits, right, dependent on using, you know, these labor requirements, you know, there is that sort of, you know, that value, right, that you don't want to risk going with a non-union contractor who maybe is not meeting these registered apprenticeship goals, right? Going with the union contractor who's been doing this for decades, that's a safer bet. And so a little bit about risk mitigation there. But yeah, anytime, like, you know, the Arizona Public Service example, there's a regulatory proceeding right now, you know, if you want to submit some comments into the record, all of that helps. Because I don't know if this is Matt and Mary's experience, but usually no one comes to these public hearings. You know, there's not a lot of turnout at these hearings. There's not a lot of engagement from the public generally, because this is such a, it's just such a inaccessible process. So any engagement, you know, the commissioners actually pay attention to that.
Great. Good final words. Thank you so much to everybody. We really appreciate all your wisdom, your experience, and suggestions, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Appreciate very much, and we'll stay in touch.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.